This video lecture will focus on the legal framework governing public schools in the United States. Education law is a dynamic and essential area that intersects with civil rights, state policy, public administration, and student advocacy. Our goal is to examine the core legal principles that shape what happens in the public school classroom and hallways every day. From the Constitution to state regulations, every decision made in schools is guided by some form of law or policy. By the end of this video, you should be able to explain how the U.S. Constitution underpins public education governance, identify and describe roles of major federal and state laws related to education, and understand the respective responsibilities and rights of teachers, students, and administrators. Lastly, you should be able to apply legal concepts to common scenarios encountered in schools. The U.S. Constitution does not explicitly mention education, so the 10th Amendment is key. It reserves powers to the states to establish and oversee education systems. However, education must comply with federally protected rights, especially those under the 14th Amendment. The Due Process Clause. This clause ensures students and teachers are treated fairly in disciplinary and employment matters. The Equal Protection Clause. This requires schools to treat students equally, regardless of race, gender, disability, or other protected status. Federally constitutional principles thus act as a boundary on how state and local governments can exercise authority over public education. Several federal laws have shaped the public school experience over time. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act, known as the ESEA, and later ESSA, was designed to provide funding and reduce achievement gaps. It holds schools accountable for measurable student success. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA, requires schools to identify and serve students with disabilities through individualized education programs, known as IEPs. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, this is actually broader than the IDEA. This prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in programs that receive federal funding. Title IX prevents sex-based discrimination, including in sports and cases involving sexual harassment. The Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, known as FERPA, gives parents and eligible students control over access to educational records and privacy. All of these laws create compliance obligations for school staff, from teachers to superintendents. Each state has its own education code and constitutionally established duty to provide public education. Key players include state boards of education. The state boards of education set academic standards, licensing criteria, and standardized testing protocols. The Department of Education is responsible for implementing federal and state policies, overseeing compliance, and disperse funding. Local school boards. They adopt curriculum, develop budgets, and district-specific policies. These elected or appointed officials work closely with superintendents to run schools day to day. Although states and localities manage schools, they must operate within the bounds of federally constitutional protections. Teachers act in loco parentis, in other words, in place of the parent, which carries both authority and responsibility. Duty of care. As a teacher, you are legally obligated to protect students from foreseeable harm. This means you must pay attention to what happens in the classroom, You must instruct students in safety protocols, for instance, in science class. You must monitor students. In other words, you can't leave students alone in the classroom without an adult. Again, you need to make sure that you are protecting students from foreseeable harm. Mandating reporting. All educators must report suspected child abuse or neglect to the appropriate authorities. When it comes to discipline, teachers must follow district policies and provide due process before administering significant disciplinary actions. When you become a teacher in the classroom, you need to be aware of what are the district policies as they pertain to discipline, and then your own schools. So having a conversation with your administrators. Freedom of speech. It's limited in professional settings. Teachers may express personal views, but not at the expense of a neutral educational environment. Teachers also have employment protections. Many teachers have tenure or are part of a union that protect against arbitrary dismissals, though teachers must still follow codes of ethics and conduct. Again, it's important that you understand the state in which you work. Does your state have teacher unions, or, as is the case in Virginia, which is a right-to-work state, you need to be aware of how schools or how districts, what is their policies and what is their procedures in terms of dismissing a teacher from the classroom. Let's look at students' legal rights. Students are not mere recipients of services. They are individuals with constitutionally protected rights. Students are guaranteed the right to free public education. This is guaranteed by the state constitutions. They have free speech, in other words, protected by the First Amendment, as seen in the case Tinker versus Des Moines. Speech can be limited if it causes disruptions. Students have freedom of religion. Students may pray or express religious views as long as it is not school-sponsored. We also see that students have protection against discrimination. So we see that in the form of Title VI, which is race, Title IX, which is sex, the IDA/504, which is disability, and others. We also see that students have due process. Before suspension or expulsion, students are entitled to notice and an opportunity to be heard. Now let's look at some landmark cases, court cases, that have shaped the application of laws in education. In 1954, there were several cases that came together, and they were known as the Brown versus the Board of Education. And this landmark Supreme Court ruling declared that racial segregation in schools was unconstitutional. A key player in this case was actually a court case, a lower court case that came from Farmville, Virginia. It was the case that involved the Morton School versus Prince Edward County. And summary of that court case, Barbara Johns was a high school student who led a walkout protesting conditions at the Morton High School and saying that the public high school or the private white high school down the street, that they had better resources and materials. And so that case was actually very pivotal in the Supreme Court declaring separate was not equal. When we look at the case in 1969 of Tinker versus Des Moines, this case had to do with affirming students' right to symbolic speech. Students were wearing these black armbands protesting the war. And so again, this gave students the right to symbolic speech. Goss versus Lopez in 1975, again, was a Supreme Court case that ruled that public school students must be given due process before being suspended. And the 1985 Supreme Court case, New Jersey versus TLO, established the standard for student searches. In other words, reasonable suspicion rather than a probable cause. Now, some current legal issues that are affecting the modern schools today. We still see issues around school safety versus student privacy. In these cases, we see the need to balance surveillance, balancing lockdown drills, and student rights. Another area that we see current legal issues around have to do with technology and student digital rights. Particularly, these issues focus around cyberbullying, digital monitoring, and one-to-one device policies. We also see that special ed compliance, the implementations of IEP, and equitable access remain hot legal topics. As a teacher, you need to make sure that if you have a student that has an IEP, that you understand what are their accommodations and you need to make sure that you are following them. And again, equity and access. There's lawsuits that still continue over disparities in funding, access to advanced coursework, and fair discipline practices. As teachers, you need to stay informed and proactive in addressing these developments in your classroom. Again, being legally informed empowers you to make better, fairer, and safer educational decisions.